I want to make clear that compared to Xi Jinping, he was much more open, much more willing to balance various forces, hardline and more moderate, where Xi is totally in one direction. And so therefore, with his somewhat more collective leadership and his instincts for good relations with the US and China's place in the world, I think you can make a case to rationalize some of his excesses, like how he treated the Falun Gong. There was no question that China's never been open and democratic in any way under the communists, but during Jiang's tenure, there was more relative openness, both in terms of economic policies and political discussion. And he did balance off. I think his willingness to at least balance competing forces in China is gone under Xi and won't be retrieved as long as he is a leader. I think the suspicions of the US will persist. So even though they will honor Jiang Zemin, I don't think they'll honor him in terms of returning to any of his more moderate policies. So you always have to wonder whether this might be repeated, that those who are unhappy with either COVID policies or lack of freedoms more generally will use this occasion, as it has been on at least 2 other recent occasions, to expand the demonstrations. So that's a fair question. I think, however, that under Xi, the repressive apparatus, the incredible surveillance system, including under testing of COVID, will snuff out the demonstrations. I don't think they will take off. I'm not sure, because none of us thought that spring of 1989 would see such huge demonstrations, even though there were warning signs. And there are some warning signs now. And China is always unpredictable. So I'm always humbled in my projections. But my guess is that a combination of cracking down hard on those who are asking for more freedom, but being somewhat more lenient on those who are only talking about COVID policies, plus some loosening up of the COVID policy for economic and political stability reasons, a more concerted campaign to vaccinate Chinese citizens, particularly the elderly. I think you see some combination of that effectively snuffing out the protests.
Jiang Zemin's problem as a leader is he never had the authority that someone like Deng Xiaoping, or indeed any of the party elders who installed him after Tiananmen, the Yuanlao, who came in and essentially ousted Zhao Ziyang and chose Jiang Zemin as the alternative. So the result of that was he never had the authority to impose his will on Chinese politics, and therefore he too often allowed himself to be forced by the hardliners to make compromises on his post-Tiananmen policy. We could cite many examples of that. I think the crackdown on the Falun Gong was the most obvious example, where he allowed the security state to essentially impose its will on what was a movement that was essentially benign, that was essentially declining in terms of a political movement when Jiang Zemin was forced to impose his ban on it. And I think the second way that he allowed himself to be pushed around by the hardliners was in his unwillingness to stand up for a party that would slowly allow government to be separated from party thinking. And he allowed essentially the hardliners to reinfuse party leadership in government. And that was, I think, something that Jiang Zemin opposed, but he didn't have the will or the ability to overrule that. So in some ways, you could say that his strengths and his weaknesses were the same, came from the same Jiang Zemin. You know, he was a consensus builder. He was someone who didn't threaten anyone. That allowed him to rebuild stability after Tiananmen, but it also meant he was vulnerable to hardline ideas that persisted and ultimately came to fruition under Xi Jinping.